August 1944. Late sun blistered the Louisiana sky until everything looked dipped in brass. The smell reached them first, smoke, butter, a sweetness that didn't belong to war. 10 German prisoners stepped out of the truck and into a yard where American farmers had built a shrine to summer. Long tables under cottonwoods, tin tubs of ice, a grill throwing sparks like fireflies. On the grates lay rows of something pale gold and ridiculous, crackling in a lattice of flame. Maize, muttered one of the older men in French he'd picked up on the Western Front, spitting the word like a seed. Animal feed. Hans Fischer, 22, rigid in the way of young men who've been told certainty is a virtue, kept his jaw clenched and his eyes forward. He'd seen posters in Hamburg, caricatures of Americans with fat hands and lazy eyes. The propaganda men said their food was an insult, their appetites proof of their weakness. He believed it, or had believed it, right up until a farmer with forearms like axe handles and grief cut deep into the lines of his face picked up an ear of the stuff, bit into it and said in a voice as rough as the bark of the trees above them, "This is what free men eat." The laughter died in the heat. Butter ran down the man's wrist like sunlit sap. Somewhere a fiddle tuned and children stopped running. Hans felt the first hairline crack travel through the story he'd carried across an ocean. He hadn't planned to taste anything that night. He didn't know the taste was going to rewrite him. They told them America would be a cage with a smile. The train had hissed them south from the port like a long iron snake, heat thickening with every county line. Through the slatted cars, they saw a country of big skies and fields that didn't know war. Cotton like cloud foam, cane as high as a man, soybeans neat as a parade. At rusted stops, women in calico dresses stared at them with a mixture of curiosity and contempt, while boys in patched overalls counted prisoners on their fingers. The guards, too young, too polite, too quiet, offered water without barking. When a prisoner stumbled getting down from the car, one of those boys reached out instinctively and took his elbow. It was all wrong. And the wrongness made Hans angry. He'd memorized the rules in case kindness turned out to be a trick. Don't smile, don't beg, don't take more than your ration, never accept a cigarette. Keep your back straight. Keep your language locked behind your teeth unless it was needed for orders. Remember the map on the barracks wall and the arrow that had always pointed toward victory, toward a line of banners that would hang forever. Remember the photograph of the Führer shaking hands with boys not much older than you, promising them history, and then Camp Rustin appeared, fences and towers. Yes, but also ball fields. A chapel, a library that smelled like glue and paper and possibility. The Geneva Convention skimmed the surface of the camp like a dragonfly, never landing but always there. Work details, pay chits, mail through the Red Cross, water breaks, shade when the sun turned mean, an interpreter with a Bavarian surname and a Chicago smile. It didn't feel like a trick. That made it feel like danger. The first weeks were sugar beets, stoop work that turned the back into a question mark and baked the neck under a hat that never shaded enough. Their boots grew a crust of red dust. Their hands learned the way American soil took and the way it gave back. The farmers didn't shout. They demonstrated this, not that. 4 inches, not 5. And then stepped back to let the work teach its own lessons. The guard sat on the tailgates and flicked ash into the wind and tried to look bored. When the tin cups went around, cold water sloshed against metal the way a bell carries prayer. Soft, Hans said to himself. To dear, to anyone who would listen. They pretend at civility because they're soft. But in the row beside him, a man twice his age with a face like weather, bent to the weeds with the same economy of movement Hans's father had used fixing bicycles in their courtyard. And there was nothing soft about the ache in his shoulders when he stood up to drink. The invitation arrived at the end of a day that smelled like cane molasses and diesel, half a sheet of letter paper, passed to the work crews by the interpreter. Private Tommy Chen. His German was careful. Schoolroom clean. Sunday the Hutchins place, he read. Cookout. A woman's hand had written the words. You could always tell when a woman had written the words. The lines were straight from habit, not from marching. The farm wives, Tommy explained, always brought the crews together at the end of the hot months. Before the war, it had been neighbors and hired men. During the war, it was neighbors and prisoners. Hutchins lost his boy at Normandy. One of the guards murmured, not quite under his breath. Hans felt his stomach drop as if the truck had hit a ditch. He imagined the face of a man who had no son anymore. This is where the mask comes off, muttered Kurt Zimmer, whose hobby was reminding everyone that defeat was a choice. This is where Americans teach you that mercy is just a word they say while they unsheath the knife. Hans nodded, because it felt like leadership. But that night, staring at the rafters while the generator purred and the night insects trapped themselves at the barracks lamp, he wondered if there were any knives left to unsheath after a man's son had been folded into a flag. The Hutchins place looked like a painting people in Europe hung on their walls to pretend the world hadn't ended. A white farmhouse with a porch that wrapped it like an arm, cottonwoods throwing shade as wide as a church, a barn painted red that had baked to brown. In the yard, card tables lined in a row, their legs wobbling in the dirt, mason jars sweating, biscuits in a basket under a towel. The air a stew of charcoal, rendered fat, cut grass, and something sweet that made the mouth water before the mind admitted it. The prisoners arrived like rope, taut and separate strands twisted into a single wary line. 2 guards with carbines watched them with the weary anticipation of men who hoped nothing would happen, but had to be ready in case it did. The prisoners were parked at one end under the trees, their boots making little print galaxies in the dust. The Americans collected at the other end, greeting each other with a reserve that said they'd decided not to let the war take everything. Hans recognized faces from the fields. He recognized the woman with the gray hair pulled into a knot who'd brought a bucket of water the day the pump seized. Margaret, someone called her. She moved through this world with the careful kindness of someone who had to choose it every day. Behind her came the farmer. Earl, someone said, heavy in the way of a man who had put his grief to work and found it made excellent fuel. Eat, Tommy translated. Please, all of you. It would have been easier if they'd been ordered. The wives set the plates like offerings. Fried chicken with a crust that shattered, potato salad that tasted of mustard and memory, tomatoes sliced thick enough to serve as an argument for summer, and then the platters of yellow, nubbled cobs with char blooms along their ribs, brushed with butter until they shone. The first laugh came short and hard, Bavarian, farm-bred, half scorn and half relief. Tierfutter, the man said, a word that fell like a brick. Animal feed. It loosened something. Another chuckle. Then more. Bitter. Nervous. Triumphant. The story snapping back around them like a harness they knew how to wear. This is what we were told. This is the joke we were promised. Hans didn't laugh. He wanted to. The shape of it was ready in his throat. But the smell of the grill, smoke braided with sugar, kept returning, and he didn't know where to put it. Earl stood. The chair made a sound against the packed dirt like a door closing. He didn't look at the guards or his neighbors. He looked at the prisoners as if searching for a particular face and finding it at last in Hans. He picked up a cob, held it for a moment like someone remembering a weight, bit, chewed. Butter found the deep lines at the corner of his mouth and gathered there like a memorial. My boy loved this, he said, voice low and gravelly. Last thing I cooked him before he shipped out. A bird called in the cottonwood. The breeze lifted the edge of a tablecloth and dropped it. He died in your country's war. He lifted the corn just enough for the light to gild it. This is what free men eat. He put it down again so gently it made a sound anyway. Margaret's hand found his forearm. For a second, Hans thought Earl would break a plate or a promise or a man, but he didn't. He stared past all of them into a field only he could see. Deer, who had the good sense never to hurry a moment, reached and took an ear from the platter. He turned it in his hand. He bit. His eyes widened because sweetness always widened the eyes. Got him, Himmel, he said softly, a prayer that steadied everyone within the distance a prayer steadies. He extended the platter toward Hans. Hans shook his head once, tight as a lock. He kept his hands flat on the table. He didn't trust them. Klaus, the kid who still believed the front might pivot in history with it, took one, bit, smiled without permission. Laughed at himself. It's good, he said, English setting awkwardly in his mouth like a borrowed jacket. Good wasn't the word Hans would have chosen if he'd let himself choose any word at all. He took the smallest bite he could make matter, and then another. What broke wasn't pride. Pride is too hard to break. What broke was the habit of contempt, and that is made of thinner glass. Around them, the camp choir of crickets tuned up toward evening. The grill hissed when butter hit flame. Children started moving again, the way children always do when grown-ups decide not to be dangerous. Every bite the prisoners took was a small white flag disguised as a meal. And somewhere in the broad field of Earl's silence, A kernel caught between his teeth, and he worried it with his tongue the way every human on Earth does. And that was the first time Hans let himself think the word human without qualifiers. The war looked different when your hands were in the furrows. The sugar beets gave way to corn, and the corn gave way to chores that had nothing to do with ideology, and everything to do with water and sun and time. The irrigation pump had a cough Earl couldn't wheeze out of it. Deer rapped it with wrenched wire and prayer, and the thing cleared its throat and agreed to be a machine again. A guard with city hands learned to snap a fence staple with the heel of his palm, because Margaret showed him once and then watched him until he got it right. Hans learned the way a stalk feels when it's more water than sugar, and the way it sounds when wind is hunting rain across a field. They kept their distance because distance is a language. But the grammar loosened. On Tuesdays, Margaret brought pies that leaned into the seasons, peach with a shy shine, apple that cracked under a spoon, custard that let a man taste milk and eggs and fire at once. On Thursdays, the chaplain came and stood under the cottonwoods and read a psalm that, according to Tommy, was about green pastures and still waters and tables prepared in the presence of enemies. It sounded in English and in German like an absurd promise and a fact. At lunch, the guards tried to teach them baseball with gestures. Swing here. Run there. Drop the bat. No, not at him. The prisoners countered with Schafkopf and Skat, and the kind of card games you can play without speaking if losing and winning have the same shape in your eyes. A guard named Kowalski, a grin with a man attached, picked up enough German to say again when he lost and once more when he won, which is probably most of what anyone needs in any language. Music crossed the fence first. A farmhand banged a two-step out of a fiddle, and the oldest prisoner hummed a snatch of Mozart he thought he'd forgotten. Margaret's nephew picked a tune on a guitar that tasted like trains and beer. Klaus learned to clap along on 2 and 4 instead of 1 and 3, and everyone forgave him when he got it wrong because he was 19, and forgiveness is what 19-year-olds deserve. It didn't turn into friendship. Friendship is a word with contracts attached. It turned into rhythm, a choreography of work and breath and heat and shade. Hans kept looking for the edge of the mask. He watched Earl the way a soldier watches a tree line. The older man worked like a plow horse and spoke like a hymn that had mislaid its god. When he laughed, which was rare, it sounded like something a storm had left behind. When he looked toward the far field, the one with the tallest corn, his eyes seemed to walk across the rows and fall into a hole. Hans recognized that fall. He'd been trying not to admit it belonged to him, too. In August, the air got heavy enough to drink. On a day that looked like molten brass poured over the world, Klaus went down. One moment, he was teasing the guard about the way he mangled the German word for boots. The next, he was face first in the dirt, his body a sack of knives. Earl reached him before anyone else. He turned the boy gently and called for water and shade with a sergeant's authority and a father's hands. "Stay with me, son," he said without meaning to. Stay. They carried Klaus to the barn, and Margaret appeared with ice like a miracle. The medic arrived, red-faced and earnest, and swapped the boy's blood-hot breath for air with a purpose. Earl didn't step away until a pulse steadied under his fingers. Later, when Klaus had color again, he told Hans he'd heard someone say son, though he hadn't understood the rest. Hans didn't tell him who had said it. That night the crew ate corn with dinner because corn had stopped being a joke and turned into an answer to a question no one wanted to ask out loud. Hans bit into it and thought about the taste. Sweetness over smoke, a crunch that yielded, heat rolling into cool. He looked across at Earl, who was listening to Margaret, who was watching him eat, who was thinking of Joseph. Hans didn't know the name yet, but he was going to. War, Hans realized, is not a single enemy. It is a weather system, and in this small corner of it the wind had shifted. The telegram was a rectangle of paper thinner than a man's skin. It waited for Hans in the camp office with a Red Cross seal and the expression of a clerk who had been taught how to say terrible things in languages not his own. Tommy stood beside the desk and translated words Hans understood anyway. Air raid, Hamburg, casualty identified. Friedrich Fischer, 16, deceased. At first, the world didn't go black. It went loud. The insects outside turned into a roar. The clock on the wall became a hammer. The scratch of the clerk's pen recorded a death Hans hadn't agreed to, didn't consent to. That arrived anyway. Condolences, the clerk said in German that had learned only that word perfectly. We are very sorry. Hans walked out of the office and found himself at the fence without remembering how his legs had carried him. He put his hands on the wire because pain helps you locate yourself. The guard on duty looked away because mercy sometimes looks like inattention. He didn't go to the fields the next day. He didn't go the day after. Deer brought bread and soup and left them where Hans could pretend he hadn't seen. Margaret sent a folded napkin with a half peach inside, and the smell made him want to throw it into the dirt for being alive when his brother wasn't. He watched the dust motes in the barracks, light drift and fell and drift again, and resented them, too. On the third night, his grief hardened into something he knew how to carry, anger, and he went looking for Earl because a wound needs a target. He found him at the shed, wiping grease from his palms with a rag that had seen better days. "Your bombs killed my brother," Hans said in English, brutalized to fit his rage. "Your people, your planes." Earl's mouth went flat as a road. His fists remembered their old language. "And your people killed my son," he said, the word son leaving his mouth like a prayer that had lost its faith. "Your guns, your orders." They stood in the place where men either try to hurt each other or decide not to. The sky went purple and insects stitched the air between them. Hans turned away because doing anything else would have made him into something he didn't want to see in a mirror. He walked back to the barracks and lay on his bunk and let the ceiling be a field with no horizon. He didn't sleep. He recited all the words he'd been taught to believe and found none of them covered a 16-year-old boy. He woke to a parcel. The guard held it like a question. The cloth around it was clean. The note on top had pencil gouged so deep the letters could be read by touch if not by sight. My son's name was Joseph. He was 19. I hate that he's gone. I hate this war. But I don't hate you. Inside the cloth sat a jar of strawberry preserves. Summer held against winter, sweetness against rot. The label read Margaret, Joseph's favorite, in a hand that had learned carefulness over a lifetime. Hans pressed the note to his chest because sometimes grief needs a wall to push against. He didn't cry in the elegant way of films. He unraveled. The sound in the barracks was not pretty. Deer rubbed a circle on his back the way a man who has seen too many battles knows you soothe an animal. When it passed or changed shape or decided to let him breathe, Hans looked at the jar and the note and understood that a man had gone into the night with his grief and returned with a gift for an enemy who had just tried to make him into a weapon. "How?" Hans asked Deer, eyes raw. "How do you do that?" "Same way you stand up after you fall," Deer said. "Not because you want to, because you must." Hans slept then, dreamless, which is the only gift a body can give a mind when it needs it. In the morning he went to the field. The far field belonged to the dead boy. Hans knew it without being told, the way you know a kept plate at an empty seat. It had the best soil, or the best sun, or maybe just the most ghosts. Earl handed Hans the tools without commentary, and walked away to fix something that likely wasn't broken. Margaret watched a moment from the porch and then pretended to be busy with jars because work is how the living keep promising the dead they'll be remembered. Hans worked the rows like a penitent. He listened to the sound of water traveling hidden paths. He let the stalks rasp against his sleeves until their green stained his skin. He pulled a cob loose, twist, snap, and set it in the basket like a relic. He imagined a boy he'd never met running these furrows with his arms out like airplane wings. Imagined a mother shouting across sunset. Imagined a father who cooked corn the night before a ship took his child across a map. At mid-morning, Earl joined him. They picked in silence. A breeze moved. Small mercy. And with it a smell of cut grass and butter and something Hans's grandmother used to make in summer when sugar was cheap and joy was not. He was suddenly and violently hungry and ashamed of that hunger, and then ashamed of the shame. They reached the end of a row and Earl did the thing he did rarely, put a hand on Hans's shoulder. It landed like a benediction. "Take a break," he said. It was both order and invitation. They sat with their backs against the same tree. Earl pulled a jackknife from his pocket and shaved a curl from an apple as if peeling regret away. He cut in silence and handed Hans the bigger half. It was the kind of arithmetic grief learns. Hans took it. The bite overshot the line between tart and sweet and went all the way to childhood. He chewed slowly so he wouldn't finish it too fast. "Danke," he said. Then clumsy, "Thank you." "You're welcome." It wasn't a treaty. It was a sentence about being men in a world that kept trying to turn them into something else. That afternoon, The crew harvested as if the weather needed to be impressed by their endurance. Margaret set out a pot of coffee at the fence for the guards and a pitcher of water for everyone else. When Klaus waved at her, her face folded in that beautiful way that carries both joy and grief. The boy didn't understand her words, but he recognized the shape of love. He clapped when she held up a pie tectonically unstable with blueberries. At dusk, the grill hissed again. The cobs came off crackling. Earl salted them like a magician, coaxing sweetness out of flame. No one laughed when the platter reached the prisoner's table. Laughter belonged to the men they'd been a month ago. Hans picked up an ear without being dared to. He buttered it the way he'd watched Earl do. Heel of the bread folded into the palm, corn rolled against it until the kernels glistened. He bit. He closed his eyes. A field rustled somewhere that didn't exist, and a boy laughed, and a mother sang over dishes, and a father patted a shoulder. A pattern of life that war could interrupt, but not erase. Across the yard, the chaplain tuned a hymn on a voice that had buried too many boys. It rose thin at first and gathered as a few neighbors wore their shame into courage. The words were about grace, which is what humans call mercy when they need it to be bigger than any one person. Hans didn't sing. He wasn't ready. But he didn't flinch either. He let the sound happen around him and felt, for the first time since the telegram, the bruise of his heart easing under the pressure of something larger than rage. When they finished eating, Earl handed Hans a jar. "Take this back," he said. "The preserves." "She made more." Hans shook his head. "For Joseph," he said softly, careful with the name like it might break. The older man's mouth found its folded line again. He loved to share. They stood at the gate when the truck returned to drag the workday across the line into night. Prisons are mostly gates and decisions about how to pass them. Hans climbed up and found his seat on the wooden bench. The truck shuddered awake. He held the jar in his lap like a child. "Tomorrow," Earl called, because men need to pretend they don't fear the future. "Tomorrow," Hans said, because men need to pretend they can make promises larger than weather. September fell on the camp like a blessing nobody thought they'd earned. The heat backed up a step. The air remembered what a breeze could be. The corn came in like a choir. The work changed shape, less brutal, more precise. You could argue with the stalks now and they'd answer. Kowalski brought a radio to the fence and tweaked the dial until something from New Orleans drifted across. Horns like birds in a hurry, drums like happy feet. Klaus danced with his hands in the way boys do when they haven't learned legs yet. The guards clapped. Margaret shook her head and smiled into her apron. Deer tapped the table with a spoon in a rhythm that knew more about Bach than Boy Scouts. A photographer from town came to take a picture for the paper. Neighbors and prisoners under the cottonwoods. The gorilla cloud, kids unself-consciously in both frames. He arranged them badly, as men who don't understand arrangements tend to do, and took the shot anyway. Somewhere that photograph still exists. If you look closely, you can see a farmer who has learned how to stand upright with a wound and a prisoner, holding a jar he doesn't fully deserve, and the space between them neither as wide nor as narrow as you'd think. The letter from Hamburg came to Hans in a hand that turned corners sharply. His mother had always written like a woman catching a train. "We cleared rubble with our hands. The British made us watch films. I didn't know. I swear I didn't. Your father doesn't speak. The house has a roof again of sorts. Come home when you can. Come clean if you can't." He read it in the field with dirt drying on his knuckles. He folded it carefully and slid it into his pocket like a shard of something holy. That afternoon he found Earl at the far field, staring. Men who have buried their children do that sometimes, as if the earth might return what it took if you look hard enough. Hans stood beside him without speaking. Sometimes standing is the only language that works. "Harvest is good," Hans said at last, his German finding English the way hands find a task. "Good," Earl said. He didn't finish the sentence. The words got stuck in the place where they live. They watched a red-tailed hawk draw a line across the sky so precise it could have been a pencil mark. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It had weight and function. It kept the world from rattling apart. News from Europe seeped into the camp like weather fronts. One day clear, the next heavy with rain you couldn't see yet. Surrender here, advance there. Flags lowered and flags raised. Lines redrawn by men in rooms. In Camp Ruston, a man learned he could say thank you in 2 languages without betraying anything essential. Another man learned he could hold his grief without needing to set it down in someone else's body. On a Sunday, the chaplain read a passage about tables again. He said the line about cups running over with a voice that suggested he knew how it sounded next to a fence. Margaret sang harmony under her breath, and the note found a path through the trees. The last Saturday before the crews rotated back to other farms, Margaret organized one more supper because tradition is a weapon against chaos. The tables came out. The grill exhaled. The corn hissed. Earl brought a crate from the root cellar. Hans carried it across the yard like penance and set it by the grill like an altar. The children darted around legs. Klaus tried to teach Kowalski a German tongue twister and failed and succeeded at the same time. They ate. Talked in the way people talk when language isn't shared but purpose is. Laughed once or twice and didn't apologize for it. When it was over, Margaret pressed leftover biscuits into the guard's hands and into Hans's because hospitality is a theology some people never stop practicing. At the truck, Earl hesitated. He reached into his pocket and produced something small, smooth wood worn to a shine. A jackknife. He flipped it open, then shut, then held it out. For when you need to cut something loose, he said. Hans stared at it. The blade reflected a sliver of sky. I can't. You can. A beat passed. Then Hans took it. The weight told him a story about tools and trust. The road back to camp threw the truck around like an idea some god couldn't make up his mind about. Hans watched the farmhouse shrink into the kind of memory that knows how to keep itself alive. He had for the first time in months something to carry that wasn't anger. Work crews end. Wars end loudly or with a whimper, but aftertaste lingers. Back inside the fence, a mess hall served something that wasn't corn, and still tasted faintly of mercy. The barracks smell returned to its usual blend of soap and sweat and paper. Tommy called out names for mail, until his voice turned into a raw instrument. Hans sat on his bunk with the jackknife in his hand and the preserves jar on the shelf and his mother's letter folded in his pocket and tried to inventory himself. He found an anger that no longer needed to start every sentence. He found a grief that had learned to live with company. He found a hunger he could name now. Hunger for a world where tables could be long enough for enemies to sit down and forget. For a meal, how to be enemies. He also found a question, and he could not put it away. If the people you called animals fed you, what does that make you? In the morning he woke with an answer that wasn't elegant and would have to do. Human, also human. The September sun ran its gold over the rows one last time before the crews rotated out, and the fences remembered how to be fences. The photograph made the paper in the parish seat. Local families host supper for POW laborers, and some readers folded the page with disgust and others with relief, and most with the deep, weary ambivalence of a country learning that mercy is expensive and still cheaper than hate. At Camp Ruston, the library stamped "Return by" on a book of American short stories a German would carry back across the ocean. In Hamburg, a mother hung a pot from a hook in a new roof and boiled water like a sacrament. In a farmhouse outside Ruston, a father ran his thumb along the edge of an empty plate and remembered a boy. And somewhere on a road that knows the way home, a truck rattled with men who had learned there are foods that taste like humility if you eat them slow enough. They had called it animal food. They laughed until they bit down and discovered sweetness and smoke and something else you can't write into a ration book. Dignity offered. Dignity received. History likes numbers. Regiments tonnage, dates stacked like bricks. But what survives in the seams is smaller and heavier. A jar left at a gate at midnight. A knife pressed into an enemy's palm. A father who says, "I don't hate you," without asking permission from his grief. If this story made you rethink what victory really means, remember this. Wars end in treaties, but peace begins at a table. Sometimes it's set under cottonwoods with butter running and corn snapping hot in your hands. Subscribe to WWII Untold for more human moments history tried to file away. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you've ever tasted a food that changed your mind about someone.